part of a series of videos that take a look at tools in the control phase of a DMAIC-based process improvement project. And this specific video will introduce the control phase, and the learning objectives are to review the activities and analysis that led your team to the control phase. We'll also describe control activities that can sometimes be performed in parallel with the implementation of solutions. And then finally, we'll list off the deliverables that should be in place by the end of the control phase. All right, I've now cleaned up my screen just a little bit, and I'm pulling information from the Business Process Improvement Workbook. I pulled up our DMAIC summary sheet. We've been referring to this checklist of commonly used activities and key milestones throughout each phase of a DMAIC project for quite a while now. And we're now finally in the control phase. And I like to remind my team when we are about to embark on the control phase that control is really about understanding future state and how do we sustain those gains. If a process's performance can be described as a needle of performance, where in current state the needle is low, and in future state we're trying to move that needle to a higher value. Our goal in the control phase is these new solutions have now been implemented. We're going to measure and monitor them, but we want to make sure that it stays in this higher position. It's all about sustaining those gains. And the specific tools, let me zoom in a little bit here so that we can see those tools a little bit better. The specific tools are pretty straightforward. We're going to make sure that the needle has indeed moved to its new higher position by validating the improvement. Once we've now seen that the future state is a new, better way of doing things, we'll standardize that approach, and then we need to close this project down. And there's some specific tools that we'll be taking a look at to help us with those three major activities to sustain the gains. But sometimes I like to remind my team where we've come from. There's been a lot of work that we've done to get to the control phase, more than just the four phases themselves, but definitely in the define phase, we use the define phase to understand current state. We collected qualitative information. That qualitative information helped us to better understand the variables that we're going to need to go out and measure in the measure phase. We call them critical to quality variables. And we've gotten a much better understanding about the scope of the project. We've also got a much better understanding of who those important stakeholders are that are affected. The measure phase was also about understanding current state. The data that we collected was more numeric in nature. It was quant data. The analysis that we performed was a little bit more detailed. It was more of a collection and review and analysis to better understand the most important CTQs, and it included a data collection plan, the review of that data. This went on in a looping-like manner, and eventually, from that analysis, we established our focus areas. My columns are starting to get a little crooked here. In the analyze phase, we are still analyzing current state. We have a knowledgeable team now. And by knowledgeable team, we had a knowledgeable team when we kicked off the project, but this team now has knowledge across the entire span of the process. They have knowledge not just in their specific area, but across all areas of the system. And we then use that knowledgeable team and all of the qualitative and quantitative data that we captured in define and measure to establish those root causes. In the improve phase, we're starting to now transition away from current state. We've determined what those root causes are in the analyze phase. And in the improve phase, we went about a broad to narrow approach at solution development. The final solutions were then put into a solution implementation plan and approved by the sponsor. It's now in the control phase that these solutions have been implemented. And so there was this missing phase associated with the DMAIC. I call it the implementation phase. And in some cases, those things that are implemented, those solutions that are implemented, they're very straightforward. The team members know how to implement them. They have the time and resources to do so, and they can just roll up their sleeves and do it themselves. Or they run them as small implementation Kaizen events, or they run them as small projects. But if it's a larger project, they'll probably bring in other subject matter experts to help implement these solutions that could take weeks or months to implement. In the control phase, as mentioned earlier, it's about sustaining the gains. There are things that can be happening as these solutions are being implemented that can happen in parallel. So while the team is looking in the control phase to sustain the gains through standardization and through a control plan and eventually through closing down the project, some of those activities can happen while the implementation takes place. Let's take a look at a couple of those things that might be happening while implementation is going on. So the solution implementation plan has been approved and solutions are now being implemented. As that implementation is going on, if my team members are actively involved with that implementation, there's not very much that I can do during implementation. My team members' bandwidth will be consumed working on building out those solutions and testing them. But frequently, those solutions are being worked on by other subject matter experts. My team is there as advisors, but they do have some available bandwidth. And if that's the case, here are some of the things that I like to have the team work on in the control phase while implementation is still taking place. We now have an understanding of what future state looks like and what those solutions are. So updating our detailed process maps is a frequent parallel activity that can happen. And it can actually really help the folks involved with implementation if they see those updated process maps. If I'm in many cases going to be in future state measuring and monitoring performance, I'll be using a lot of the tools and techniques and queries that we developed in the measure phase, but occasionally there are some new CTQs, some additional data metrics that are monitored in future state. And so I'll update that data collection plan. While solutions are being implemented, I can frequently work on some of the documentation and creating of those standard operating procedures. I have to be careful though, sometimes I can't do that until that solution already is implemented, but sometimes we have enough information that we can start working on that in advance. Same is true with job aids and checklists. These are some of the tools that we create to help standardize future state. And we've got a separate video on some tips related to both documentation, SOPs, and job aids and checklists. But uh, I, I still will frequently have my team members working on it in parallel while implementation happens. And training is often something that can be done during that implementation time period. Now, frequently it's just the development of the training materials, the development of the learning objectives, maybe development of the in-person or out-of-person classes, and but sometimes the training actually can be to the individuals, process workers, and stakeholders that are affected by the future state solution. So most of the time it's about building the training content. Sometimes though, during implementation, we can actually train those people. And we can definitely start planning the project close, letting those stakeholders know that letting process owners and process workers know when they can expect to see this new future state solution in place, and starting to signal to the team when our final meeting times are going to be, and planning that celebration that is really important at the end. It's also a good time to start planning for a project report out. Sometimes these report outs are part of the training, but they are also often part of the closing activities, and in some cases also tied to the celebration itself. So project report out planning can happen in parallel as well. In follow-up videos, we'll explore some of these standardization tools, and we'll be taking a look at some monitoring, measurement and monitoring techniques known as statistical process control, or a way to really better understand through time series charts run in control charts the amount of shift in central tendency and variation reduction that's happened in future state. Follow-up videos on standardization and SPC to follow.